guys, welcome to my channel. My name is ReadingBear and I hope you are ready for some more stories. And today, we'll take a look at some new entitled people content. If you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comment. And now, let's dive right into the stories.
The first story is titled, "Neighbor blocked my driveway during a medical emergency and threatened to get the police and ambulance towed." TLDR. I have to call an ambulance for my mother, and when they get there, they can't open the door because neighbor is in his car blocking the street. He makes a threat to have the ambulance and police car towed and gets them angry. When they try to arrest him, he almost runs over the policeman and speeds away. He is later arrested on multiple charges and even loses his license and has to have his own car towed. Luckily my mother is fine, and neighbor can now learn a few lessons on how to behave from behind bars in jail. There is way more excitement in this story than I can abbreviate in the title. This might be a little long, so I am just going to get straight into it. Me and neighbor share a driveway and he clearly doesn't seem to like this fact. Even though it is wide enough for both of us, he tends to like to park his car either right in the middle or even in the street to block me. One time he didn't like how I parked and actually called the towing company to have my car towed, claiming that I was in his private driveway, and he didn't know who the car belonged to. He also has moved my trash cans because they were on his property, they weren't. Basically, this guy had serious boundary issues in the sense that he wanted everything even near his property to be considered his. Now this particular day he was parked on the street blocking my car, and which was annoying on its own. I had bigger issues to deal with because my elderly mother who lived with me hadn't been feeling well lately. Unrelated story cut short, she basically was found to have issues with her heart, and we were told that if certain signs happened to get her to the hospital immediately. Well, she was showing these signs and I didn't want to waste a moment thinking before I called 911 and got an ambulance on the way. The only reason that I even knew about his car was because as the paramedics were tending to my mother, one pulled me aside to talk to me. "Paramedic, is that your car parked out front? The street is too tight so we can't open the back of the ambulance unless you move it." Me. "My car is in the driveway." "What car is it?" He describes the car and I know right away it is my neighbor's and go out to see the situation. He wasn't just parked in front of the driveway like I had assumed, and he probably was before. No, he was actually sitting in his car and stalling right in the middle of the street. He moved up so close to the ambulance that they couldn't get the back door open, and the entire time he was screaming at them from outside of the car window. I asked if they wanted me to go talk to them, but they said they would handle it. I don't know about other areas, but where I live, when an ambulance is called, they also send a police car with them just in case, I guess. Anyway, I was able to overhear the entire thing because of how loud he was screaming and honking the horn, forcing the officer to yell as well. "Neighbor, get the hell off of my property. You need to leave right now, you are violating my rights." Policeman. "Sir, there is a medical emergency, and we need you to move for the ambulance." Neighbor. "You can't tell me what to do on my own street, you aren't welcome to park in front of my house. I am going to stay right here to stop you from leaving and make sure that all of you get towed." Policeman. "We were called here for an emergency, and if you don't stop right now, I will have to arrest you for interfering with us." Neighbor. "The only one getting arrested is you for going near my property without my permission." The policeman gave up at this point and decided to walk up to the neighbor's car door and try to open it. I guess he was going to pull him out to arrest him and move the car so my mother could actually get in the ambulance. If you want to know why the ambulance simply didn't move, just know that I am the last house on a dead-end street, and because of where neighbor was keeping his car, they didn't even have the room to turn around, let alone move forward anymore to get her in. Neighbor, I guess, finally realized he was going to be in trouble, and as soon as the policeman got to his car door, he put it in reverse and stepped on it. He went backwards until he could turn around and get out of the street. The policeman had to jump back so he wouldn't get hurt from this guy driving. I didn't actually know for a while what happened with him because I was in my car following the ambulance to see how my mom was. She thankfully was fine, and I was able to come back home after a couple of days. I know though that most of you are excited to find out what happened to neighbor because it was kind of obvious. He wasn't going to just get away with doing that to a policeman and paramedics without some kind of consequence. They knew his car and where he lived, so it really didn't take long before they caught him and were able to arrest him, but it took me a while to find out exactly what he was charged with. I thought he was just going to get a fine or something for threatening them, and I was wrong, as they decided it was going to be a lot more serious than that. I also found out that some of it was dependent on my mother, because if she ended up worse off because of him, he could be charged with that as well. Since she was fine, though, he only got charged for the things that happened that night. The first of which being interfering with emergency services, which on its own held a big fine and potential jail time for him depending on the seriousness of it. Then it was actually attempted assault when he almost ran over the policeman when fleeing. The best part in my opinion though was that because of the maneuvering and speeding he did, they also charged him for reckless driving and had his license taken away. Since he wasn't home at the time though, they needed to get a tow truck to take his car away, so after all of that the karma was so sweet. He wasn't considered a danger to anyone though, so he was let out without bail until the day of his trial. Those details were kept a little more private and I wasn't able to find out exactly what happened. His sister has been taking care of the house though, so I know that at least he is going to be in jail for a little while. I guess neighbor didn't think that going after people like police would have actual consequences after getting away with bullying regular people like me for so long. In the meantime, though, I am enjoying that nice big driveway for myself most of the time and just happy that my mother is doing okay. I'm not that upset since she ended up okay at the end. I just find it a story that has such good karma it needs to be shared. I don't know when or if he is coming back to his house, but I have a feeling if he does, he is going to have changed a little bit. A personality like that, I have a feeling he is going to learn in jail pretty quickly that he can't just bully people and decide that everything is his property. The next story is titled, 6 Feet Out, or 6 Feet Up. I was reminiscing with my family about my late grandfather and some of the tomfoolery he got up to. I thought this story made a perfect post for this sub. Backstory. Decades ago, my grandparents purchased a large plot of land out in the middle of nowhere with the idea to build themselves a home and retire on that plot. They were both from the rural Midwest, so they originally wanted to keep horses, chickens, and maybe a few other small farm animals on this land, hence the size. As the years went by and they started actually making plans, they realized that horses weren't really feasible for a variety of reasons. By that time the area around their plot of land had been significantly more developed, so they instead split the plot into 8 pieces and sold the other 7, essentially financing their original purchase and the construction of the house, leaving their retirement and pension untouched. Because of their incredibly advantageous position, they made a point to only sell to like-minded buyers, friendly retirees who were looking for their last home and wanted a bit of the same rural isolation that my grandparents wanted. The result is that my grandparents ended up with their dream bungalow on a spacious lot surrounded by friendly neighbors, and without any major time or money obligations. They ended up spending a lot of time volunteering and generally making friends with the community that was growing around them. The area ended up becoming incorporated, and the town they were now living in eventually decided that the 2-lane blacktop road needed to be repaved and upgraded with sidewalks, gutters, and all the other amenities townspeople expect. Now the county that the town was incorporated from had planned ahead, and there was plenty of room set aside for exactly this type of project, so none of the residents needed to move their fences or give up property to the state. However, most of them had placed their mailboxes on a post about a half-dozen of feet from their property line, nearer to the road so that the postman had easy access. When the construction started, a city representative visited each property on this street and gave them a heads up on what to expect, and also asked that the residents move their mailboxes to make room for construction. My grandfather, being of light schedule and helpful demeanor, offered to help his neighbors temporarily relocate their mailbox and post. He had retired from a career as a handyman, and several of his children owned landscaping or similar businesses. So, he and my uncle spent a few hours with a mini backhoe and unearthed all 8 of his neighbors' mailbox posts, cement and all. He saved the posts to reinstall when the road was complete and mounted the mailbox proper on each property's fence. The issue. Lo and behold, on Monday they had no mail service. After a bit of investigation, they realized none of their neighbors did either. So, the next morning my grandfather waited outside to see what the problem was. Right on time, the mailman drove down their side of the street, completely ignoring all 8 properties. Redoubling his efforts, the next morning my grandfather was able to flag the mailman down and ask what the problem was. According to my grandfather, the very curt response was, "I'm not required to deliver to any mailbox more than 36 inches from the edge of the road." A call to the postal service confirmed this rule. The mailman may deliver outside that limit if they want, but they are not required to. The compliance. Now it's pretty amazing what you can get done with 8 business hours of free time. The problem was that 36 inches from the current edge of the road is in the way of construction. My grandfather spoke to the construction supervisor, who was sympathetic but just as stuck as my grandfather was. My grandfather then visited the postal office and returned with a current copy of the regulations about mailbox locations. After a few hours of study, and another visit to the construction supervisor's office with a half-dozen donuts and some coffee, he had formulated a plan. Remember his sons who ran landscaping businesses? My grandfather got in his truck and visited both businesses. He returned home with 8 20-gallon plant pots. These things are huge, 30 inches tall and just about as large around. You see, while the construction guys couldn't mess with a federally protected, fixed mailbox, they were happy to move a pot out of their way in the morning, and back when the job was finished for the day. My grandma makes some pretty damn good donuts, which is a pretty easy task when you have earth-moving equipment nearby. So, each post was replanted in a 20-gallon pot and each mailbox was remounted on a post and each pot was placed conservatively within 36 inches of the current road's edge. The kicker was that a mailbox post that is meant to stick 4 feet out of the ground has at least 2 feet buried in the ground. In other words, it's a 6-foot post. When you put that inside a pot with a few inches of soil underneath and that pot on the surface of the ground, a mailbox on top is easily more than 6 feet in the air. You see, the mailbox codes clearly specify how far horizontally a mailbox needs to be from the road but say nothing about how high that mailbox needs to be. It took a few more conversations with the postman, and a visit from the local inspector, but the mailman spent the better part of 6 months delivering to 8 mailboxes 6 feet in the air rather than walk the extra 6 feet to the fence. The next story is titled, "Yes ma'am, I will destroy your lawn. TLDR. A Karen demands that I seed and mulch her lawn, so I do." A few years ago, I worked as a full-time volunteer for a disaster relief organization building houses in a Midwestern town in the US that had recently been decimated by a large tornado. I was a site supervisor, essentially a general contractor and overseeing volunteers for a single project, beginning to end. Above me, I had a project manager, PM, who would oversee several houses, make sure we had what we needed, make sure we met deadlines, etc. So, one day as I'm wrapping up my current house, my PM calls to tell me that one of the other supervisors has been having kind of a hard time with their volunteers and asked me to go help out on their site for a few days. As I show up to the house, currently just a foundation and frame, a supply truck is pulling out of the backyard. It has apparently been late getting there, because there's a crowd of bored-looking volunteers sitting out front, and the site sup is looking pretty antsy. I go up and introduce myself to everyone and start game planning with the other sup when a very angry lady starts screaming at us from next door. We go ask her what's up and she is absolutely spitting, because we drove all over her lawn, killing all her grass. Now, you have to understand that when I say this town was decimated, I mean that not a single house, not a single tree in this entire part of the town had been left standing. Enough time had passed that many houses had been rebuilt, but my point is that as far as you could see in any direction was still an ugly mess, and her grass wasn't making a lick of difference. Admittedly, when she pointed out where the edge of her giant double lot was, it did look like the truck had left some light tire tracks. Other site sup said he really needed to get back to the volunteers and so I told him I would take care of this. I apologized and explained that it was the only way that we could get to the backyard, but that it wouldn't happen again. Then tried to change the subject, taking about how awesome it was that all these kind volunteers had driven hours and were giving an entire week to help build her neighbor a free house, and weren't people just beautiful, and wouldn't it be great to have the area property value go back up. None of my diversions worked and she just kept frothing herself up. She eventually said that she wanted to speak to my manager. Luckily, he was only a few blocks away, and when he got there, I explained the situation. He seemed pretty irritated and told the lady flat out that we were a volunteer organization, building her neighbor a house, and that it was pretty petty to get so pissed about us driving along the edge of her property. Well, you can imagine how that went over, and she said, "I demand that you completely reseed and mulch my yard." I smiled and said, "How about we use straw?" Edit. For those who don't know, this is me offering an out. Mulch is used in landscaping to prevent grass and weeds growing. Strawing after seeding protects the seed and doesn't prevent growth. My PM looked at me deadpan and said, "Don't be a cheapskate, Anon." She said mulch. The self-satisfied smile she gave me is something I will treasure for all my life. We spent the rest of the day seeding, then mulching her entire double lot. PM even made a call and got someone who supported our noble goal to donate several truckloads of mulch. We worked next to her for the next 2 months. All of her grass died, and she never said a word about it. The last story is titled, HOA Board Campaign to Do Nothing. I lived in a small, 18-house neighborhood that had a deed-restricted HOA. We had a minimal common area along the main entry street that needed maintenance and some drainage infrastructure that needed to be maintained. Not much work had to be done at all. No one wanted to be on the board, so I ran for the board with the slogan, "I will do nothing more than is legally required to fulfill the legal requirements of the HOA." This slogan was enough to get 4 more neighbors to run with the same slogan. We had the typical committees, all with the same members and with the same idea: leave everyone alone, fulfill our legal obligations and move on. I was walking down the street one day and was accosted by a neighbor who said, "You don't deserve to be president." I replied, "You're right, I don't deserve it." This really set her off, so she started yelling at me about all the things I should be doing. Planting a specific kind of flower, forcing her neighbors to do things unregulated by the HOA, etc. So, I invited her to run for president. I told her that she could submit a petition calling for a special election and I could guarantee that everyone on the board would sign it and probably vote for her to take on the job. This, of course, just infuriated her. So, she started writing letters to the board complaining about everything. We ignored the letters, which, technically, was a mistake. Our HOA documents required all letters to receive a response. She continued to send letters that had nothing to do with the HOA, so we crafted a malicious compliance response that read, "Thank you for your letter to the HOA board. After careful consideration, we have decided to ignore it." We then included instructions on how to call for a special election to have us kicked off the board and promised her the support of all board members if she chose to circulate the required petition. She sold her house and moved. Our board continued with the same philosophy for the 12 years I lived there: nothing more than legally required and leave everyone the hell alone. We would hold a homeowners meeting once a year, which was nothing more than a potluck dinner. We had to invite someone from the compliance company who worked for us to make sure we covered everything required for our annual meeting and reporting, and we would always have an agenda item under new business. Does everyone promise to be a reasonable adult? I've moved to a new, 14-house neighborhood with an HOA. I haven't yet decided if I'll run for the board. Edit to answer a common question: why not dissolve the HOA? An HOA was required for a planned community, which was the type of community in which we lived. Planned communities are built under specific laws and regulations, and one of the requirements is that they have an HOA. In order to disband, or form an HOA, you have to have unanimity of all property owners. Typically, the HOA is created by the builder, so when people buy the house in a planned community, they're buying into the HOA. It's a deed restriction. Assuming we could get the unanimity required to disband the HOA, we would still have the problem that the HOA, as a legal corporation, owned common areas, property owned equally by all homeowners, and we had common infrastructure, a drainage system. Someone would have had to have been able to take ownership of that property, and the resulting liability, pretty much an impossibility. That drainage system only benefited the homeowners, and it made sense that it be owned by the community, thus the need for the HOA. Thanks for listening.